Everyone says World War II started in 1939, but the real war, its road was already built by 1936. Think about it. 3 years, 1,095 days. That's all it took for the world to sleepwalk into the deadliest conflict in human history. In Part 3, we witnessed Hitler's terrifying consolidation of power, the Rhineland remilitarization, the moment when Europe should have acted, but didn't. Now, you're about to see the 4 years when the world had every chance to stop Hitler, 4 years when Britain, France, and the League of Nations could have prevented 55 million deaths, but everyone stayed silent. This is the story of how that silence turned a regional dictator into an unstoppable force. The story of secret moves, betrayals, and gambles that should have failed, but didn't. The story of how the world chose peace and got war instead. Welcome to Part 4, The Road to War. Dictators who despised each other became partners in reshaping Europe forever. In October 1936, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini signed an agreement that would change the balance of power on the entire continent. They called it the Rome-Berlin Axis. The world would soon call it something else, the beginning of the end. But here's what most people don't know. Just 2 years earlier, Mussolini had been Hitler's biggest critic. In 1934, when Hitler first tried to annex Austria, Mussolini actually mobilized Italian troops to the Austrian border to stop him. He called Hitler a horrible sexual degenerate and a mad little clown. So what changed? Ethiopia. In 1935, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in a brutal colonial war. The League of Nations responded with economic sanctions against Italy, Britain, and France. The same powers who claimed to defend international law suddenly isolated Mussolini. They pushed him away. And Hitler? Hitler saw an opportunity. While the world condemned Italy, Germany welcomed it. Hitler offered Mussolini what Britain and France wouldn't: respect, trade, and most importantly, no judgment. The dictator who had once mocked Hitler now needed him. By October 1936, they stood together. The Axis powers were born. Europe was shocked, but here's the terrifying part. Nobody opposed it. Britain watched. France watched. The League of Nations, already weakened, did absolutely nothing. Two fascist regimes now united, with their eyes on the rest of Europe and the democracies. They were too afraid to act. The chess pieces were moving, and Europe was running out of time. Spain became Hitler's laboratory for mass destruction. July 1936, a civil war erupted in Spain between the Republican government and fascist nationalist forces led by General Francisco Franco. It seemed like Spain's internal conflict, but it wasn't. This was Hitler's rehearsal for World War II. Germany sent planes. Germany sent tanks. Germany sent soldiers. Over 16,000 so-called volunteers flooded into Spain, but these weren't volunteers. They were Luftwaffe pilots, tank crews, and combat engineers, all gaining real battlefield experience. Hitler called it the Condor. Legion.history would call it a war crime testing ground, and then came April 26, 1937, the town of Guernica. It was market day. Civilians filled the streets, families shopping, children playing, and then at 4:30 in the afternoon, the sky turned black with German bombers. For over 3 hours, the Luftwaffe carpet-bombed Guernica, wave after wave of explosives and incendiary devices. They weren't targeting military installations. They were testing a new strategy, the total destruction of civilian morale through terror bombing. 1,600 people died. The town was reduced to rubble. And the world? The world saw the photographs. They read the reports. They understood what this meant. This was a warning. This was Hitler showing Europe exactly what he was capable of. But did Britain act? Did France intervene? Did the League of Nations impose sanctions? No, they debated. They discussed. They did nothing. Meanwhile, Hitler's military was learning. Every bombing run, every tank battle, every tactical mistake was being documented, analyzed, and perfected. The Spanish Civil War wasn't just about Spain. It was Hitler's training manual for invading Europe, and there was another player in Spain, one that would haunt the world for decades: the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin sent weapons, advisors, and the Soviet secret police to support the Republican side. This wasn't about defending democracy. This was about expanding Soviet influence. Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies, were both using Spain as their proving ground. The Spanish Civil War ended in 1939 with Franco's victory, but the real winners? Hitler and Stalin. They had tested their armies, refined their strategies, and learned one critical lesson. The democracies would not fight back. 50,000 German troops had rotated through Spain. They returned to Germany as battle-hardened veterans. And Hitler? He now had the most experienced air force in the world. The rehearsal was over. The real performance was about to begin. Hitler annexed an entire country without firing a single shot. March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border. Tanks rolled through Vienna. The Austrian military stood down, and within hours, Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation. This was the Anschluss, the Union. Hitler called it his homecoming. Because here's what made this different from every other invasion. Hitler was Austrian, born in Braunau am Inn, raised in Linz, rejected by Vienna's Art Academy twice. Austria wasn't just another conquest. This was personal. This was revenge and validation rolled into one. But here's the part that shocks most people. Austria didn't resist. There were no massive protests, no armed rebellion, no desperate calls for help to Britain or France. Instead, crowds flooded the streets waving Nazi flags. They cheered. They screamed, "Heil Hitler," until their voices went hoarse. Church bells rang across Vienna, celebrating the arrival of German troops. How did this happen? How did an entire nation welcome annexation? Fear played a part. The Austrian Nazi Party had been growing for years, terrorizing opponents, destabilizing the government. But there was something else, something darker. Many Austrians wanted this. They saw themselves as German. They blamed the Treaty of Versailles for separating them from Germany. And Hitler? He promised to make Austria great again, part of a greater Germanic empire. The Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg had tried to resist. He called for a referendum, letting Austrians vote on independence. Hitler's response? He threatened invasion. Schuschnigg backed down, resigned, and was arrested within hours of German troops entering Vienna. Britain's response? A formal protest. Nothing more. France's response? Concern. But no action. The League of Nations? Silent. And here's the secret that makes this even more terrifying. Hitler had been bluffing. German commanders later admitted they weren't fully prepared for the invasion. If Austria had fought, if Britain and France had intervened, Hitler's entire operation could have collapsed. But nobody called his bluff. Instead, on March 15, 1938, Hitler stood on the balcony of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the same palace that had once rejected him as a nobody, now declaring Austria part of the greater German Reich. 7 million Austrians became German citizens overnight. Hitler's Reich grew by 20%, and Europe learned another lesson. Appeasement works better than opposition. The dominoes were falling faster now, and the next one was already wobbling. The democracies didn't just fail to stop Hitler, they helped him carve up Europe. September 1938. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border regions of Czechoslovakia. His excuse: 3 million ethnic Germans were oppressed and needed protection. Sound familiar? The same playbook he used for Austria. But this time was different. Czechoslovakia had allies, treaties with France, agreements with Britain, a mutual defense pact with the Soviet Union. Europe now faced a choice: stand up to Hitler or surrender another piece of the continent. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain chose surrender. On September 29, 1938, Chamberlain flew to Munich. He met with Hitler, Mussolini, and French Premier Édouard Daladier. 4 men deciding the fate of millions, and Czechoslovakia not even invited. That's right. The country being carved up wasn't allowed in the room. For hours they negotiated. Hitler demanded everything. Chamberlain and Daladier gave him everything. The Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia's fortified border, its defensive mountains, its industrial heartland, all handed over without a single shot fired. At 1:30 in the morning on September 30th, they signed the Munich Agreement. Chamberlain returned to London, waving the paper like a trophy. He stood before 10 Downing Street and declared, "My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. Peace for our time." The crowd cheered. Chamberlain was celebrated as the man who avoided another world war. But in Prague, there were no celebrations. Czech citizens wept in the streets. Their leaders felt betrayed. They called it the Munich Dictate, a death sentence imposed by their allies. And here's the tragedy. Czechoslovakia had one of the strongest armies in Europe, 35 divisions, modern fortifications along the border, a powerful weapons industry. France and Britain combined had over 100 divisions. If they had stood together, if they had called Hitler's bluff again, historians agree, Hitler would have been forced to back down. Even German generals were preparing a coup if his gamble failed. They knew Germany wasn't ready for war, but Chamberlain chose appeasement over action. He believed he could negotiate with a dictator. He thought giving Hitler the Sudetenland would satisfy him. Hitler learned a different lesson. He learned Britain and France would sacrifice anyone to avoid war. He learned treaties meant nothing. Alliances meant nothing. All that mattered was who was willing to take what they wanted. Within days, German troops marched into the Sudetenland. Czech fortifications, factories, and natural defenses fell into Hitler's hands without resistance. Czechoslovakia was left defenseless, surrounded, waiting for the inevitable. And Hitler? He was already planning his next move because appeasement doesn't stop aggressors. It feeds them. Hitler broke his promise, and the world finally realized appeasement was a lie. March 15, 1939, just 5 months after Munich. Just 5 months after Chamberlain declared peace for our time, German tanks rolled into Prague, no warning. No demands, no negotiations. Hitler simply took the rest of Czechoslovakia, and this time was different. This time, Hitler wasn't claiming to protect ethnic Germans. The Sudetenland had been his excuse before. The German-speaking regions he swore were his last territorial demand in Europe. But Prague? The Czech heartland? This was the first time Adolf Hitler occupied land where Germans were the minority. The mask was off. This wasn't about uniting German-speaking peoples. This was naked conquest, pure expansion, the beginning of Lebensraum, living space for the German Reich, carved out of other nations. Czech President Emil Hácha was summoned to Berlin, 70 years old, suffering from a heart condition, dragged before Hitler in the middle of the night. For hours, Hitler and his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, screamed at him, threatened him, told him that German bombers would level Prague if he didn't sign over his country. Hácha collapsed. Hitler's doctor had to inject him with stimulants just to keep him conscious. And then, barely able to hold a pen, Hácha signed the document that ended Czechoslovakia's existence. By morning, German troops occupied Prague. The swastika flew over Prague Castle, and 15,000 Czech Jews began a desperate scramble to escape before the Gestapo arrived. Europe was stunned. Even Mussolini, Hitler's ally, was caught off guard. Britain and France, the architects of Munich, suddenly realized they had created a monster. Chamberlain's illusion shattered. In the House of Commons, he was forced to admit what everyone now knew. Hitler had broken his word. The assurances he gave me at Munich were worthless. But here's what made this moment a turning point. For 3 years, Britain and France had convinced themselves that Hitler had limited goals, that he was simply reclaiming German territories, that he could be reasoned with, negotiated with, appeased. The occupation of Czechoslovakia destroyed that fantasy. If Hitler would take Prague, he would take anywhere. If treaties and agreements meant nothing to him, then nowhere was safe. Poland was next. Everyone knew it. Hitler had already been making demands for the Polish corridor, the strip of land separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Polish leaders watched German troops in Prague and understood exactly what was coming, and this time, Britain and France couldn't look away. On March 31, 1939, just 2 weeks after Prague fell, Chamberlain stood before Parliament and made a guarantee that would change everything. Britain would defend Poland. If Germany invaded, Britain would declare war. France followed with the same promise. The line had finally been drawn after Austria, after the Sudetenland, after Czechoslovakia, after 3 years of appeasement and retreat. The democracies finally said no more, but was it too late? Hitler had spent 3 years building his military, testing his weapons, expanding his territory. Germany was stronger than ever. And Europe? Europe had given away its best chances to stop him. The clock was ticking. Hitler's next move would trigger the war that everyone had tried so desperately to avoid. The two greatest enemies in the world became allies, and Poland's fate was sealed. August 23, 1939, Moscow. In the Kremlin, two men signed a document that stunned the entire world. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, sworn ideological enemies, had just become partners. Hitler, who had spent years calling communism a Jewish conspiracy to destroy civilization. Stalin, who had purged anyone suspected of fascist sympathies. These two dictators, who represented everything the other despised, shook hands on a deal that would reshape Europe. They called it the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty. Germany and the Soviet Union promising not to attack each other, but that's not what shocked the world. Non-aggression pacts were common. What shocked everyone was the timing. Britain and France had just guaranteed Poland's independence. Hitler was clearly preparing to invade, and now, suddenly, the Soviet Union was removing itself from the equation. Stalin had just given Hitler permission to start World War II. But here's what the world didn't know. Hidden inside that agreement was a secret protocol, a clause that wouldn't be revealed for decades. Germany and the Soviet Union had secretly agreed to divide Eastern Europe between themselves. Poland would be split down the middle. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania carved up and absorbed. Finland and Romania, their fates decided by two dictators drawing lines on a map. This wasn't a non-aggression pact. This was a conspiracy to destroy an entire region of Europe. So why did Stalin do it? Why would he partner with Hitler? Stalin knew war was coming. Soviet intelligence had been warning him for years, but the Red Army wasn't ready. Stalin's brutal purges had decimated his officer corps. In 1937 and 1938, he had executed or imprisoned over 30,000 military officers, including almost every senior commander. The Red Army was broken, leaderless, and unprepared for modern warfare. Stalin needed time to rebuild, and this pact gave him that time. Let Hitler fight Britain and France first. Let them bleed each other, and when they were weak, the Soviet Union would be ready. For Hitler, the pact was a masterstroke. His generals had been terrified of fighting a two-front war. Invading Poland meant war with Britain and France in the West. But what if the Soviet Union attacked from the east? Germany would be crushed between two enemies, just like in World War I. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact eliminated that threat. Hitler could invade Poland without worrying about Soviet interference, and when Britain and France declared war, Germany could focus all its power on the Western Front. It was a double victory for Hitler. Poland surrounded, the Soviet threat neutralized, and Britain and France isolated. On August 24, 1939, the day after the pact was signed, the world reacted in disbelief. Communists around the globe felt betrayed. Stalin had abandoned the fight against fascism. In Paris, communist newspapers stopped criticizing Hitler. In London, the Labour Party split over how to respond, but in Warsaw, there was only dread. Polish leaders understood exactly what this meant. They were surrounded, Germany to the west, the Soviet Union to the east, and their allies, Britain and France, were 1,000 miles away. The pact had one more secret consequence. It emboldened Japan in Asia. If Germany and the Soviet Union could set aside their differences, Maybe Japan could too. The tripartite pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan was just a year away. The Axis powers were aligning. The Soviet Union was standing aside, and Poland was running out of time. Hitler had his green light, and nothing could stop him now. World War II began with a lie. August 31st, 1939, 8:10 p.m., a small radio station in Gleiwitz, Germany, near the Polish border. Suddenly, armed men burst through the doors. They were wearing Polish military uniforms. They overpowered the staff, seized the broadcast equipment, and transmitted a message in Polish, calling for an uprising against Germany. Then they vanished. But they left behind evidence: a dead body, dressed in civilian clothes, shot and left at the scene to prove Polish aggression. Except none of it was real. The attackers weren't Polish soldiers. They were Nazi SS operatives in disguise. The dead body wasn't a victim of Polish violence. He was a German concentration camp prisoner, murdered and staged as proof. The entire incident was fabricated, ordered by Hitler, executed by Reinhard Heydrich. It was called the Gleiwitz Incident, a false flag operation designed to give Hitler exactly what he needed: an excuse. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared, "Last night, Polish troops attacked our territory. Since 5:45 a.m., we have been returning fire." Even the time was a lie. German forces had already invaded at 4:45 a.m. Before Hitler even finished speaking, 1.5 million German troops poured across the Polish border, from the north, from the west, from the south, 53 divisions, 2,500 tanks, and the full might of the Luftwaffe. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a new kind of warfare the world had never seen. German tanks smashed through Polish defenses at impossible speeds. Stuka dive bombers screamed from the sky, striking not just military positions, but roads, railways, and fleeing civilians. The goal wasn't just to defeat the Polish army, it was to create total chaos, paralyze the nation, make organized resistance impossible. Polish forces fought desperately. Cavalry units, outnumbered and outgunned, charged German positions with suicidal bravery. Polish pilots flew outdated aircraft against the Luftwaffe's modern fighters. But courage couldn't stop what was coming. Within hours, Polish cities were under bombardment: Krakow, Łódź, Warsaw. The Luftwaffe made no distinction between soldiers and civilians. Markets, hospitals, neighborhoods all became targets in Hitler's doctrine of total war. Britain and France watched in horror. They had guaranteed Poland's independence, promised military support, but when the invasion began, they did nothing. No troops marched to Poland's aid. No bombers struck German cities, only diplomatic protests, demands that Hitler withdraw. He wasn't listening. On September 3, 1939, 2 days after the invasion, Britain and France finally declared war. Prime Minister Chamberlain addressed the British people. "This country is at war with Germany." France declared war hours later, but their words changed nothing on the battlefield. Poland was alone, fighting for survival against the most powerful military machine in Europe. And then, on September 17th, came the final betrayal. Soviet troops crossed Poland's eastern border. Stalin, honoring his secret deal with Hitler, invaded from the east while Germany crushed from the west. The Polish government fled. The army collapsed. By October 6th, organized resistance ended. Poland, a nation of 35 million, ceased to exist. Divided between two dictatorships, its cities destroyed, its people enslaved, World War II had officially begun. But it didn't start on September 1st, 1939. It began years earlier, in the Rhineland, in Spain, in Austria, in Czechoslovakia. Every time Europe chose appeasement over action, every time they let Hitler take one more step, the war truly began the moment the world decided that stopping a dictator was too costly, too risky, too difficult, and by the time they realized their mistake, 55 million people would pay the price. From 1936 to 1939, the world had a choice, and the world chose silence. Think about what we just witnessed. 4 years? 4 critical years when Adolf Hitler could have been stopped, When he remilitarized the Rhineland, his own generals were terrified. They expected war. They expected France to march in and crush them. Hitler admitted later that if France had opposed him, Germany would have retreated in humiliation. But France did nothing. When Hitler and Mussolini formed the Rome-Berlin Axis, Europe should have seen two fascist dictators uniting as an existential threat. Instead, they watched and hoped it would somehow resolve itself. When the Luftwaffe turned Guernica into rubble, the world saw exactly what Hitler's military could do. They saw the future of warfare, terror bombing, civilian casualties, Totalvar, and they looked away. When Hitler annexed Austria, he was bluffing with a military that wasn't ready. One strong objection from Britain or France could have collapsed the entire operation. But they sent diplomatic protests and nothing more. When Chamberlain handed Hitler the Sudetenland at Munich, he thought he was buying peace. Instead, he was funding a war machine. Czechoslovakia's fortifications, its weapons factories, its natural defenses, all gifted to Germany without a fight. When Hitler broke his promise and seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, the illusion finally shattered. But by then, Germany was too strong, Hitler too emboldened. The moment to stop him had passed, and when Stalin signed the Nazi-Soviet pact, the last obstacle to Hitler's invasion disappeared. Poland was surrounded, Europe was divided, and 55 million people were about to die. Every single one of Hitler's gambles succeeded. Not because his military was unstoppable, but because the democracies were too afraid to act. They were afraid of another war, afraid of the casualties, afraid of the cost. They remembered World War I, the trenches, the gas attacks, the 10 million dead. They would do anything, sacrifice anyone, to avoid that nightmare again. But their fear didn't prevent World War II. It guaranteed it. Appeasement didn't buy peace. It bought time for Hitler to prepare for war. Every territory he took made Germany stronger. Every victory made him bolder. Every moment of European silence convinced him that nothing could stop him. And he was right. Until it was too late. From 1936 to 1939, the world watched Hitler build the most dangerous military machine in history. They watched him test his weapons in Spain. They watched him swallow Austria and Czechoslovakia. They watched him partner with Stalin to divide Europe. And this silence, this 3-year, 11-month, and 2-day silence, made World War II unavoidable. The invasion of Poland wasn't the beginning. It was the inevitable conclusion of years of cowardice, miscalculation, and misplaced hope. By September 1st, 1939, the world had run out of chances. The war that everyone tried to avoid had become the war that no one could stop. 55 million people would die. Entire cities would be erased. The Holocaust would consume 6 million Jews. The atomic age would dawn, and the world would be changed forever. All because from 1936 to 1939, when it mattered most, the world chose to do nothing. That is the true story of how World War II became unstoppable